In the middle of a brutal Ohio winter, a group of firefighters walked out of their station after a 24-hour shift, and instead of driving home to their warm beds, they drove to a freezing cold garage stacked with plywood and rolls of foam insulation. What they have been building in that garage on their own days off, with money out of their own pockets, has quietly changed hundreds of lives. And the whole thing started with a single emergency call on a freezing December night. A call that one veteran firefighter says he could not stop thinking about no matter how hard he tried. It was a few days before Christmas in a working-class city in northern Ohio, the kind of night where the wind comes off the lake and cuts straight through your coat. The thermometer outside the fire station read 4 degrees, and Captain Dale Ambrose, a firefighter with 26 years on the job, was hoping for a quiet shift. Around 2 in the morning, the tones dropped. A delivery driver had spotted someone lying motionless behind a grocery store, half covered by a piece of cardboard and a thin gray blanket stiff with frost. When the crew arrived, they found a man in his 50s named Marcus. He was still breathing, but barely. His hands were the color of candle wax, and his eyelashes had frozen together. The firefighters wrapped him in warming blankets, loaded him into the ambulance, and got him to the hospital just in time. The doctor said another hour out there, maybe less, and the story would have ended very differently. For the crew, calls like that were sadly nothing new. Every firefighter who works in a cold weather city has a story like it. You treat the patient, you write the report, and you move on to the next call because that is the job. But this time, something about it stuck to Captain Ambrose like a burr. Maybe it was the cardboard. Maybe it was the fact that Marcus kept apologizing to them over and over for being a bother. A man freezing to death behind a grocery store, apologizing for the inconvenience. Dale went home the next morning and could not sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, going cold in front of him, and he started doing the math that nobody likes to do. Hundreds of Americans die from the cold every single winter, and many of them are people living outside. He had spent his whole career pulling people out of burning buildings, and yet the thing that was quietly taking lives in his own city was not fire at all. It was the opposite. It was cold. So he did what firefighters do when something is broken. He decided to fix it with his hands. That weekend, Dale cleared out half of his garage, borrowed a table saw from his brother-in-law, and bought a stack of plywood sheets with his own money. His plan was simple, almost stubborn in its simplicity. He was going to build a small, insulated, lockable shelter. It was not quite a house and not quite a shed, something in between. A warm, dry box that could keep a human being alive through an Ohio winter night. His wife Carol came out to the garage that first evening, saw the sawdust in his hair and the sketch taped to the wall, and asked him what on earth he was doing. Dale told her about Marcus and the frozen blanket. Carol looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she went back inside and came out 10 minutes later wearing work gloves. They built the first wall together that night. The design went through a lot of changes in those early weeks. The first version was basically a plywood coffin, and Dale knew it. So he raised the floor off the ground to keep the cold from seeping up. He lined the inside walls with rigid foam insulation and a layer of reflective material to trap body heat, the same principle behind the thermal blankets his crews carried on the trucks. He added a small window for daylight, a vent so the air stayed fresh, and most importantly, a door that locked from the inside. Because when he had asked people living on the street what they wanted most, the answer surprised him. Warmth was second. The first answer, almost every time, was safety. A door you can lock changes how a person sleeps. The finished shelter was about the size of a garden shed for one person. Inside, on a cold night, body heat alone could bring the temperature up more than 30 degrees compared to outside. It cost roughly $1,000 in materials and took about 3 days of work. The first one went to a man named Walter, who had been sleeping in a bus shelter near the river for 2 winters. Dale and 2 off-duty firefighters delivered it on a borrowed trailer, set it on a patch of ground behind a church that had given permission, and handed Walter the key. Walter turned the key over in his hand like it was made of gold. Then he stepped inside, sat down on the sleeping platform, and started to cry. He told them it was the first door he had been able to lock in 3 years. Dale drove home that night and told Carol they were going to need more plywood. Back at the fire station, word got around the way it always does in a firehouse, which is to say, instantly and with plenty of teasing. The younger guys joked that the captain had started a birdhouse business, but then one of them, a ladder truck operator named Tony, showed up at Dale's garage on his day off, still smelling like smoke from the shift before, and asked where the extra hammer was. The week after that, 2 more came, then a paramedic, then the battalion chief's wife, who it turned out was better with a nail gun than any of them. You have to understand what a day off means to a firefighter. These men and women work 24-hour shifts. They come home exhausted, having seen things that most of us will thankfully never see. Their days off are for sleeping, for their kids' ball games, for catching up on the life that the job keeps interrupting. And yet, here they were, week after week, standing in a cold garage in January, building warm little houses for strangers. When a local reporter later asked Tony why he gave up his rest days for this, he shrugged and said something the crew still repeats. He said, "We already run toward the emergency. This is just running a little earlier." But the garage could only hold so much lumber, and that was becoming a real problem. Then the community found out. A neighbor posted a photo of the firefighters loading a finished shelter onto a trailer, and within days, envelopes started arriving at the station. $5 from a widow on a fixed income, with a note saying she wished it could be more. $100 from a retired school teacher. A local lumberyard owner named Frank, whose father had been rescued by firefighters back in the 70s, called and said that from now on, plywood and insulation were at cost, and delivery was free. Retired firefighters, men in their 60s and 70s, who thought their serving days were over, started showing up with their old tool belts. One of them, a 73-year-old former engine captain, took over quality control and inspected every hinge like the shelters were going to the moon. By the end of that first winter, the crew had built and placed 11 shelters, and every single one of them came with a story. There was Ruth, a woman in her late 60s who had been living in her Buick with a little terrier mix named Biscuit after losing her apartment. She had a family somewhere, but pride is a heavy thing, and she had never told them how bad it had gotten. She had been parking the Buick in a different spot every night so nobody would notice, running the engine in 20-minute bursts to keep from freezing, rationing gas the way other people ration groceries. A patrol officer who knew about the project spotted the frost on the inside of her windshield one morning and made a quiet phone call to the station. The firefighters found her a spot in the church lot, and when they handed her the key, she asked very quietly whether Biscuit was allowed inside too. Tony got down on one knee, scratched the dog behind the ears, and said, "Ma'am, we built it with him in mind. They had, in fact, added a small dog bed shelf to that one the night before. Not every placement went smoothly, though, and the crew learned that with a young Army veteran named Chris. He was not yet 30, and he had been sleeping under a highway overpass because the crowded shelters made his nerves worse. At first, he would not even come look at the little wooden structure. Too good to be true, he told them. And in his experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually came with strings. It took 3 visits and a fellow veteran on the crew sitting with him on a curb for an hour before Chris agreed to try it for one night. The lockable door mattered more to him than to anyone. That first night in his shelter was, by his own account, the first full night of sleep he had gotten in over a year. He told the crew that when the wind howled outside and he stayed warm, something in his chest finally unclenched. Now, everywhere the firefighters went, people started asking the same question. Neighbors, church groups, folks at the grocery store. What can the rest of us actually do when the temperature drops? And the crew's answer is worth passing along because winter is dangerous for a lot more people than we like to think, especially older folks. Their first piece of advice costs nothing. Check on your neighbors. If someone on your street is elderly and lives alone, a knock on the door during a cold snap can genuinely save a life, because a broken furnace can turn a home dangerous in a matter of hours. Second, never heat a home with a gas stove or a charcoal grill, no matter how cold it gets. And third, keep an emergency warmth kit in the car, because the calls that haunt firefighters most are the ones where somebody slid off a rural road in a snowstorm and sat in a freezing car for hours waiting for help. That kit is simple: water, a flashlight, some food, and above all, something that can hold your body heat. Dale's crew got very picky about that last item, because those thin foil blankets tear if you look at them wrong. What they landed on, and what several of the guys now keep in their own trucks and give to their parents, is a compact thermal shelter called the TerraShell. It uses the same heat-reflecting principle they built into the walls of their shelters, but it folds down small enough to live in a glove box, and it is tough enough to be reused instead of shredding the first time out. Dale gave one to his own mother, who is 81 and still insists on driving to church in the snow. If you have someone like that in your life, or you do a lot of winter driving yourself, it is honestly one of the cheapest pieces of peace of mind you can buy. There is a link in the description below if you want to take a look at the one the crew uses. The firefighters kept coming back to the same point. The cold does not care who you are. Staying warm in a stranded car is survival, plain and simple. And being prepared is a kindness you do for the people who love you. But back in Ohio, just as the project was finding its stride, it very nearly got shut down. Someone filed a complaint with the city. The shelters, the complaint said, violated building codes. They were not permitted structures. There were letters, then an inspection, then a notice that the shelters behind the church might have to be removed. The crew was heartbroken. Ruth asked Tony if they were going to take her door away. Tony did not have an answer for her, and he said that drive home was the worst of his career. Dale understood the concern, at least on paper. Rules exist for a reason. And the man who filed the complaint was worried about property values and precedent, the kinds of worries that sound reasonable from a warm living room. But Dale had held Marcus's frozen hands in his own that December night, and paperwork looks different after that. So instead of getting angry, the crew did something smarter. They invited the whole city to come and talk about it. A public hearing was scheduled at City Hall for a Tuesday evening in February. Freezing rain was falling that night, the kind of weather that keeps people home. Dale expected maybe a dozen folks in the seats. Instead, they had to open the overflow room. Neighbors came. The lumberyard owner came. The widow who had mailed $5 came. And she brought her whole Bible study group. A doctor from the emergency room stood up and described in plain language what severe frostbite does to human hands. And then Walter, The very first shelter recipient walked slowly to the microphone in a donated suit jacket, held up his key, and said, "This is the first thing I have owned in years that nobody can take from me. Please do not be the ones who take it." The room went silent. Then it stood up and applauded. The council did not just let the shelter stay. They worked with the fire department to create a special provision for emergency micro-shelters on approved lots, with the church parking lot as the first official site. One of the council members who had been most skeptical ended up volunteering at a build day that spring, and by all accounts, he is terrible with a drill and shows up anyway. After the hearing, the story traveled. A firefighter in Minnesota emailed asking for the plans, then a station in Colorado, then Michigan, then upstate New York. Dale and the crew made a decision that tells you everything about them. They put the entire design online for free. Every measurement, every material, every lesson learned, including the dog shelf. Their only request was that anyone who built one had to send a photo. The wall inside Station 19's kitchen is now covered in those photos. Little wooden shelters standing in the snow in a dozen different states, each one built by somebody's neighbors. The church lot in Ohio grew into a proper little village, 12 shelters now, arranged in a horseshoe with a gravel path, solar lanterns, and raised garden beds that Ruth planted with tomatoes the following summer. Volunteers from the congregation bring hot meals on Sundays. A local barber comes once a month with his chair and clippers because he says a person stands differently after a good haircut. A retired nurse checks blood pressures on Wednesday mornings and fusses at everyone about their salt, which the residents pretend to mind and secretly love. At Christmas, somebody strung lights along the gravel path, and Ruth swears the little village looked prettier than half the neighborhoods in town. Chris, the young veteran, got steady work through a contact he made at a build day, and he now rents a small apartment across town. He still comes back on weekends. He says he owes the place a debt, and he pays it in sawdust. Which brings us back to where this whole story began. To Marcus, the man behind the grocery store. Marcus survived that December night, but after the hospital released him, he disappeared back into the city, the way people in his situation so often do. Dale looked for him for over a year. He asked at the shelters, at the soup kitchens, at the library where folks go to stay warm. Nothing. He had started to fear the worst. Then, one gray afternoon the following November, a thin man in a donated coat walked up to the church lot while the crew was setting a new shelter on its blocks and stood watching from the sidewalk for a long time. Tony noticed him first. The man asked if this was the Firefighters project he had heard about, and then he said, "One of you carried me out from behind a grocery store 2 winters ago. I never got to say thank you." Dale put down his drill and walked over. He recognized the eyes before anything else. The same eyes he had seen over the edge of a warming blanket 2 years earlier. And the two men stood there in the cold, shaking hands and not letting go, while the whole crew pretended very hard to be busy with something else. Tony later admitted there was an awful lot of sawdust in everyone's eyes that afternoon, considering nobody was cutting any wood. Marcus received the 14th shelter. He stayed in it for 8 months while a caseworker from the county helped him get his identification sorted out, then his benefits, then a room in a supportive housing program. But before he left the village, he asked Dale for one thing. He wanted to learn how to build. These days, if you visit a build day at Station 19, you will likely find Marcus there, measuring twice and cutting once, teaching newcomers how to fit the insulation panels just right. He works on the shelters that are exactly like the one that saved him. He says every wall he raises is a thank you note. Captain Dale Ambrose is retiring next year after nearly 3 decades of service. When a reporter recently asked him what he was proudest of in his whole career, everyone expected him to mention a dramatic rescue. Instead, he pointed across the church lot at the little wooden village glowing in the winter dusk and at Marcus laughing with Tony over a crooked hinge, and he said, "I spent my career answering calls. This is the first time I got to answer one before it happened." Stories like this one rarely make the evening news, but they are happening all over this country, in garages and church lots and fire stations, carried out by ordinary people who simply decided that somebody had to do something. If this story warmed your heart the way it warmed ours, hit that subscribe button, because every week we share stories inspired by real acts of kindness about everyday Americans quietly looking out for one another. And there is one on your screen right now about a mail carrier who noticed something on his route that ended up saving an entire family. You will want to hear how that one ends.